Hi there, it's Linda Berens here. I just want to talk to you today a little bit about the difference between development or consciousness development, as some people call it, or even ego development, but the kind of development we have naturally and what we talk about with type development. So um, basically, I have a few little things to share about type development and about development in general. You know, development just happens. A baby just learns to walk. We don't really have to teach a baby how to walk. And unless something interferes, something drastic happens, most babies manage to learn to walk by themselves. And of course, we like to think that we're helping them walk, and learn that because that's fun and it's a great interaction. Our role during that development time is to make things safe for the baby to walk, to remove obstacles, to have things that aren't so sharp edges that if they fell against them that it could be seriously damaging. So this is kind of true also for human development in general, and the kind of development that isn't as obvious as the physical development that we have. Now, when I first learned about type, I learned about temperament first, which we now call essential motivators. But then I learned about the dichotomies from the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And then I learned that really what it was about was type development. And that it wasn't just about getting this label in this category, but it was important to understand that we may come into the world, well, we do come into the world with a predisposition to think about things in certain ways. And that's the lens that we call the cognitive dynamics lens. And that's the work, based on the work of Carl Jung, primarily. So this idea that we are born with a tendency to develop, and that we're born with a pattern, a predisposition to think about things in certain ways, that our psyche is going to, or our soul in a way, is going to evolve in certain ways. So I want to share a few screens with you to kind of talk about these things and kind of get clear on what is development in general, and then what do we mean when we say type development. So here we are. We are born into this world with a core self. That's that tendency that we tend to talk about, that we have for, with the certain aspects that we come into the world, some predispositions that we have for developing in certain ways and for having certain talents, certain core psychological needs. All of these things are what we call the core self. But the core self comes into a world where there are certain structures, parental structures, for example. There are cultural memes. There's a culture of accepted ways to do things, and that gets laid down very early around our core self, especially the family culture. We're born into what we call a zeitgeist, like the tenor of the time. And there are all these systems that are sort of pushing against us, if you will. And so situations happen, push against us, and our core self, and we respond in a way, in some kind of behavior. And that's the self that we call the contextual self. That's the aspect of yourself where you're the most flexible and adaptable. And then all of that pushes in on the core self, and it becomes habitual. Then it becomes some part of the developed self. But the core self has an innate pattern for developing, and so that's some of what we mean by type development. So we are born programmed to adapt and to grow. And we adapt in certain ways that may make us look a little different than our core self. And especially if we've not been allowed to be our core self, if the way we are naturally is not accepted, it's different from our parents or the culture that we're in, or for some reason our tendencies just aren't accepted, then we will adapt to that and grow in certain other ways, and may have suppressed the core self. there is this developed self. Now, there are a couple of kinds of development that I want to talk to you about. And also talk to you about how an understanding of type can help with those. Now, one is called horizontal development, and many uses of type facilitate horizontal development. Horizontal development means that you're moving along horizontally, much with the same theme that you would have when you started out. So the way type helps us with that is it gives us a map for self-mastery. It sort of lets us know who we are at our core, and we can start to recognize things that will feed us, and things that are nurturing for us, and things that aren't. It enables us, and much of the work we're doing at Inner Strength is helping people reclaim a wounded self. When you come into the world and you have certain things happen that you have to respond to with a stress response, or that you're not, the message you get is that you're not okay the way you are. And many of us have had those messages over our lifetime, actually. Understanding that that difference is due to something natural can help us reclaim that wounded self. And it helps us also have a map for what are our natural talents. And maybe we wound up, developing some skills and things that weren't natural to us. And I've met many people who lived a whole lifetime of doing work that was not rewarding because it didn't match their talents. And so understanding our type patterns can help us develop those talents. Now, it also gives us a way to add skills and behaviors that we might not have thought about adding, things that maybe are outside our natural developed self. Okay, now what's vertical development? Vertical development is a development that is different. It is transformative in a way. So there's something that stays the same, but when we develop vertically, we transform and develop other aspects of ourselves in different ways. So the key aspects of vertical development is that, well, if we understand that, that gives us some maps for perspective taking, and understanding type also gives us that map for perspective taking. But this will tell us, really help push us to stretch a bit. And it's also, vertical development involves increasing the complexity and the nuances of our constant core tendencies, so that we can transcend some of the limitations of those tendencies and still include them. And it also lets us know some things that are in shadow. So if you know the cognitive dynamics lens, the Jungian lens, you will know that there are 8 cognitive processes, and that we have preferences primarily for 2 of them, and those play heroic and helping roles in our personality. And then we have some easy access probably to a couple of other of those 8 processes. And then there are 4 processes that tend to be more in shadow, and that are really not necessarily designed to be fully developed. Sometimes we have to dip into those. They're available to us, and they sometimes surprise us with all of that kind of, oh, how did I do that? Was that really me? Did I, I don't usually do that. So things that are sort of suppressed and not owned. So type can really help us with our vertical development, but it is not the same, exactly the same as a type development. So let me talk to you about consciousness development. Some people call this ego development. And just plain understanding your type will help us develop this consciousness as we become to understand how we make sense of the world. And as we become aware of that, then we actually, it can have a little more say over what happens, and we become aware of what we're doing. And that's the biggest use of type that I'm finding these days, and maybe why it's so popular. It's about how that sense or meaning making matures over time is really what the development is. And that maturation is as we develop vertically, there's an increase in the complexity that we can handle. We become more informed, more complex, and more flexible. And there are time dimensions that we will access more, from only this now, sense to linear time, and then to kind of becoming aware of the past, the present, and the future, and how it's all interrelated. And one of the main factors is an increased ability to take perspective of others. So to get this kind of development, we have to become aware of what our perspectives are. Now, this is usually shown as a spiral, this vertical development, and development proceeds in a sequential manner. Doesn't mean you don't dip down out of that development from time to time. There are a couple of ways that we can look at the development piece. We start out with being merged with we don't really recognize that we're separate. And as we grow, we notice some separation. And then we realize that we're different, but my way's better, because that's our own perspective. We haven't yet learned how to take perspectives. We're different, but sometimes your way is better. That's a consciousness development that happens as we transcend the limitations of our own perspectives and start to include others. And we come to the point where we start to see that all differences are good, rather than getting caught up in polarities, in right and wrong. And eventually, if this development proceeds on its normal path, we get this sense of unity or oneness. Now, there are many models that have names and labels for this vertical development. I'm just going to share one with you because it's nice and easy to understand. We start out with what might be called a magical childhood mind. This is the work of Robert Keegan, as explained by Jennifer Garvey Berger. Then there's the self-sovereign mind, where it's really we're thinking about ourselves mostly. And then there comes a socialized mind, where what we do is determined a great deal by what's acceptable. And those are stages that we all go through. Some of us stay longer in one stage or another, and we can get down, as we develop, we don't leave behind what was before. It is included. We transcend the limitations of it and include it. And then we have a self-authoring mind. And this is one of the main uses of typists, to help us get to this point of self-authoring, where we can really make choices, conscious choices, about how we behave in response to those differences. This is where we actually are more moving into all differences are good. And then there is the self-transforming mind that we can develop, where we are in charge of our development. So there are these different ways of looking at vertical development and conscious development. And I want to just share with you, stop and chat about that difference. So with type development says you start out with some preferences. And it isn't about extroversion or introversion. It's about, for example, my preferences are INTP by the type code. So that tells me that I lead with introverted thinking, analyzing, and that I've been doing that since I was a very little girl. And I got in a lot of trouble with it sometimes, but it is really the leading role, and the way I can be heroic, as John Beebe says. Now, sometimes when you're heroic, you want to overdo that. And so then the N in the type code stands for extroverted intuiting, and INTP. So my tendency then is to see interconnections, possibilities, and all kinds of things that we could do, and to read between the lines a lot of times. And so that I tend to use in support of other people. And that's the parental role, the good parent role that John Beebe talks about. Now, those two tend to develop fairly early on and become pretty comfortable for us. And there's no real set time for the development of the other processes, But what we mean when we say we develop them, we use them, we use them, we use them. We get more skill with them, and they become automatic, and they become more complex in our use and refined as that development goes on. So we're not limited to those two aspects, that we have also a process that plays a leading role that doesn't show up in the type code. I mean, it plays a relief role, or what John Beebe called the puerpuelo, or the forever child role. And it's a place where we get rejuvenated. So for me, that's introverted sensing. And I remember, I can track back to when I started paying more attention to information that was stored, and now at my age, I've had lots of experiences to fall back on, and I tend to trust that information, whereas before I didn't pay much attention to it. I was always interested in new ideas and new things to do. Okay, so we could go through this whole type development piece, in that each of the 8 functions, cognitive processes or Jungian functions, plays a role in our personality in a hierarchical way. And we do tend to develop and get outside the limitations so that we have access to those. And for me, I lead with introverted thinking, but I aspire to extroverted feeling, which is to pay attention to what other people need, and to focus on connecting. So this is what we naturally get drawn to do if we allow it. And so type development is really about creating the space where we can own what's there naturally and open up to developing other aspects of ourselves. Now, according to the Jungian theory, the other 4 of the 8 processes or functions, they also play a role in the personality, but it isn't our job to consciously develop all of them. That if we had everything all developed equally, we would just be tumbling around, constantly confused about what to do. But they do play an important role and give us access to our unconscious, and to different openness to other kinds of experiences. Sometimes we can get stuck in those. Now, so how does that relate to consciousness development? Well, consciousness development happens, and it's you can have consciousness development around each of these processes. My understanding of development is that you can't, and of type development in particular, that you can get skill in these other processes. I mean, all you have to do is get a job somewhere and get skilled and earn your living that way. You might wind up doing things that aren't natural to you. Like if I had a job as an accountant, accounting, first of all, it's not in line with my purpose, but it's also not something that comes easy to me. I barely understand what my bookkeeper and accountant have to say. And if I had to do that, I could get skilled in doing that. But would it match the way I'm hardwired? No, it wouldn't. And it probably wouldn't match my purpose on the planet. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't do a good job. Doesn't mean that, I couldn't excel at it. I could get skill at it. And it requires a lot of accounting, which uses a lot of introverted sensing, comparing to what was expected. So the distinction here between type development is that it gives us a path or a map for the kinds of activities we may want to open up to. And development is limited by the context that we're in. So if we're in a certain context, we may find ourselves having a lot of dis-ease. We're not comfortable, we're restless, we're wanting something else. That may be a clue that it's time for us to try to find other contexts or other situations where we can develop different aspects of ourselves. My understanding is that development happens in a natural, emerging way if we're open to it. It doesn't mean that we have to develop all things equally. It doesn't mean that we have to develop in a vertical way to transcend everything. Not everybody is designed to do that. So the distinction between consciousness development is that it is our ability to become aware and to become self-authoring, to be able to get outside ourselves and have a sense of oneness and unity with others and with the universe even, those are later stages of consciousness that we can develop and that cultures develop actually in these different stages. But type development is specific to developing the Jungian functions and developing our skill with those, and namely about being open to using them. So if we're using type in a way that is labeling, like INTP, oh, well, you're a thinker, so therefore you don't do, then we have limited development if we use it that way. So we want to always be open to calling these processes and using gerunds like thinking and feeling, and I have preferences for, because we want to create a context where it's safe to develop, much like the context we create for babies when they're learning to walk. So I hope this has given you some insights into consciousness development and that kind of transformative change that happens, and how type development is something that we can be open to. And when we're introducing type to people, we want to do it in a way that doesn't shut down their openness to other aspects of themselves that are just wanting to emerge and play a role in their personality. So I hope you found this interesting and helpful, and see you next time.